And so, what does a scared little crook dictator who stolen too much money do in order to prevent that from happening? It's simple. Machiavelli 101. You find a foreign enemy and you start a war.
Hello. Our guest this week on The Edge is the head of Hermitage Capital Management, Bill Browder, recently knighted by His Majesty King Charles III, an event that took place after our discussion, but something that we here at On the Edge wholeheartedly support. So well done, Bill. He was given that award in no small part because of his efforts to tackle autocracy and corruption on a global stage. But it stems from Bill's time in Moscow in the 90s, a period which we both were eyewitness to. And it is also awarded to him mostly for being a major irritant to Russian President Vladimir Putin and his ilk by holding them accountable for their crimes under a law, sadly, named after Bill's slain Russian lawyer. We discuss all of that and so much more. So,
Well, Browder, it is a pleasure to have you here. You are high on Vladimir Putin's list of least favorite people in the world. So we take that as a great compliment and are happy to have you here. But for those in my audience who may not know who Sergey Magnitsky was, could you briefly kind of outline who he was and what the act is that is named after him that you have championed?
So, Sergey Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia. I was running an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. I started complaining about corruption in the companies I invested in. In retaliation for that, I was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided by the police. They seized a bunch of documents, and I hired Sergey, who was a lawyer, to investigate why they had confiscated these documents. And he discovered that the documents were used in a complex fraud in which $230 million of taxes that I had paid to the Russian government was stolen from the Russian government by a bunch of crooked officials. Sergei figured out who did it, how they did it, and he testified against them and exposed their crime. In retaliation for doing that, they arrested him, they tortured him for 358 days in pretrial detention, and they killed him on November 16, 2009, at the age of 37. And his murder was the turning point in my life. It was the most horrific trauma to watch effectively my proxy being killed in front of me in slow motion. And I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And the way I went about doing that was to go to different governments and parliaments around the world and explain to them the Sergei Magnitsky story, and to say to them that the one way we can get justice is to freeze the assets and ban the visas of people who committed this crime and commit similar types of crimes. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act, named after Sergey Magnitsky, my lawyer. And the Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States in 2012, then in Canada, then in the UK, then in the European Union, then in Australia, in Iceland, Norway, Kosovo, Montenegro, and various other places. It now exists in 35 different countries, and it's the template, which is what was then used after Russia invaded Ukraine to sanction oligarchs and other officials. And so one man's death, Sergei Magnitsky's death, has led to a huge policy, which in some respects is one of the most damning things for these crooks, these killers.
a huge thorn in Vladimir Putin's side. And I want to get back to the kind of financial, the kleptocracy questions. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to that. But I'll just take a quick moment here um, and mark the sacrifice of Sergey Magnitsky, but equally also to mark those who die in Russian prisons, who are in essence political prisoners. We saw recently the death of Navalny in a prison. Um, you know, Russian prisons are in and of themselves oftentimes a death sentence. When you become a ward of the state in Russia, there's a lot of abuse that comes with it, the guards, the very system of a penal colony. So we mark the tragedy of losing Sergei and Alexander and so many countless others, but of course, obviously keeping in mind those who are currently in prison, friends of yours, I believe, such as Vladimir Karamurza, or Ilya Yashin. So something obviously to keep in mind. Moving forward, however, let's talk about this kleptocracy that existed in the 90s. You and I were both in Moscow in the 90s. A lot was happening there. It did seem like the wild, wild east. There was a lot of kind of chaos and corruption, and there were accusations of like carpetbagging by the West, coming in, grabbing everything that wasn't nailed down, but then also Russian oligarchs. Did we mess up the 90s? Is there any responsibility on our side during the 90s that eventually brought about Putin? Because Putin, was this guy who came in and said he was going to crack heads of, the foreigners and the oligarchs and the corruption. Did we miss a step there?
Well, if you were to speak to Putin, he would say it's all our fault, and he has
Of
no
course, yes.
he has no responsibility for anything. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the Russians did what the Russians wanted to do, and we might have, there might have been some professors funded by the U.S. government that went in and gave advice to the Russians on their privatization program, or the IMF was going in and telling the Russian central bank what to do. But at the end of the day, these people are not like imbeciles and children. They're highly sophisticated individuals who specifically wanted to steal as much as they possibly could in a moment of chaos, and they set up rules and processes in order to do that. And yeah, we could have done a lot of stuff differently, but to like for anyone to say that we're the ones responsible, it makes them like babies. Of course, they're not babies. These people are proper grown-up mafia crooks who had a very specific agenda, which was to become unimaginably rich, and they wanted to figure out how to do that. And if it helped to have a Harvard professor say you should privatize things this way, they would do that. But it's their responsibility what they did. And yes, what happened in the 1990s is what set up Vladimir Putin by basically allowing 22 oligarchs to steal 40% of the GDP of Russia from the Russian people so that they could live in villas and mansions and fly in private jets and yachts, and have the rest of the people living in abject poverty. That was a terrible, terrible thing. But who was responsible for that? Boris Yeltsin was responsible for that. The oligarchs were responsible for that. There was a whole sort of conspiracy within Russia to make that happen. And of course, if some useful idiots from the West could help, put a stamp of approval on that, all the better. But they were going to do it one way or another. And yes, that unfairness, that privatization program, that all the oligarchs stealing from everybody, that is what set up Vladimir Putin. And then we all know what Vladimir Putin did when he was set up.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning, I think, that while the Russians made a kind of tacit agreement with Vladimir Putin, just bring us stability, stop the chaos, we'll overlook all the infringement on our civil liberties and all the rest of it, as long as you bring us stability and a restoration of our global status. Here in Ukraine, where that system was also, that kleptocracy was also being built, Ukrainians took a very different view. In our kind of hubris, I think, this is my opinion, something I've said for many, many years, we thought that after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the victory in the Cold War, that it would be our system that went east. our democracy, our system of capitalism. What sadly, actually, in my opinion, again, seems to have happened is that their corruption, like a virus, went west. And we see it throughout Western capitals, whether it's Paris or New York, notably a certain former president who associated with a lot of these kleptocrats from Russia and the former Soviet Union. And then, of course, in London, which is often kind of referred to as Londongrad, you go down this Knightsbridge or in Kensington, and you hear Russian, and you see the Russian mistresses with their, Gucci bags. Did we underestimate, the kind of possibility that this Russian corruption would find root in our systems, and how damaging has it been?
Well, I think that we didn't underestimate. We didn't estimate at all. The Russians were just busy looking for any weak hands and anybody who was, that they would go around unashamedly trying to bribe everybody. And they'd approach 10 politicians and maybe one of them would say yes. And then they got one politician on the payroll. And all of a sudden, if that person, wants to say, actually, I'm not really interested in doing this, they say, well, we're going to kill you if you don't. And so you've got a bunch of idiots, who sold themselves out to the Russians, and here they are now, all working for the Russians. And so it's been a big problem. And of course, also you have all these concierges and money managers and lawyers and PR specialists and all these people who all, for a very small price, were ready to sell their souls to the Russians. And they became what I call the enablers. And as you mentioned, one of the big exports that Russia has other than oil and gas is corruption. And in order to export it, you need to import it. And there were all these people working on importing it in London and New York and Geneva and all these other places. And I would argue that the reason for all the troubles that Ukraine is facing right now comes back to this. Now, I estimate that $1 trillion was stolen from the Russian people between year 2000 and 2022, which is when the war started. And Putin was in this position where he and about 1,000 people around him understood that they were going to get hung from the lampposts by the people at some point for stealing all this money, because everybody was living in this terrible misery while such a small number of people were enjoying the benefits of all this money, which should have been spent on hospitals and schools and roads and so on. Instead, it was spent on all this luxury for these small number of people. And so Putin was absolutely scared that one day they're going to come for him. And when he loses power, he doesn't just lose power, he loses his money, he goes to jail, and he dies. And so what does a scared little crook dictator who stolen too much money do in order to prevent that from happening? It's simple. Machiavelli 101. You find a foreign enemy and you start a war. And you distract people from you to a foreign enemy. I don't think that the war in Ukraine, Putin's murder in Ukraine, has anything to do with NATO. It has nothing to do with Russian imperialism. These are all it's simply a guy who's stolen too much money, who's a little man who's scared to death, scared of dying, literally scared of dying, will do anything to prevent that from happening. And the best thing to do is to start a war and to continue that war. And there's no other explanation for the sacrifice that Putin is making in Ukraine than his just desperate desire to stay in power. And for what it's worth, all of the people who really understand Russia in Russia, Alexei Navalny, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Garry Kasparov, myself, we all say the same thing. This is why he's doing this. It's not because of any other reason. And so you have these political scientists working in governments around the world trying to set policy about what to do about this war and what to do about Russia. And they all think that there's some kind of deal that can be done. And there's no deal that can be done because Putin is not going to do a deal because he wants this war to go on. This war helps him. This war keeps people from getting rid of him. And so the only way that this thing can end, and the only thing that can happen, is if Ukrainians beat back the Russians. And at that point, the Russians will take care of Putin themselves instead of that's the only way this thing is going to come to an end. And unfortunately, that's not the position that the Western governments are taking at the moment.
No, it isn't, and you're 100% right. With the additional factor of I do think there is some imperialism because this is the restoration of this kind of greatness of Russia, and this is the contract in part that Putin has made with the Russian people, and it's collapsing on him. Um, but this is one of the things that, for example, Navalny and Medusa were so good about exposing the fact that the reason you don't have good roads, or now with the war, obviously, the reason why, so many soldiers are dying and all the rest of it, it'll all be worth it because we'll have this grand new empire and restoration of our status on the global stage. Um, but it's not just the corruption internally within Russia. It's not just the his cohorts that he's found fertile ground for spreading that corruption in the West. It's not just financial corruption. We do see also them supporting like extreme right wing movements in the West in an effort to destabilize things using their money oftentimes. So talk to me a little bit about the corrosive influence of Russian finances and money.
Well, I'll tell you a funny little story. There was an election going on in Madagascar, a tiny little country,
Okay.
island country off the coast of Africa. And
Sure.
you're going to wonder why I'm talking about this, but you'll see in a second. There's this election going on. This is like 5 or 6 years ago, and there's a group called the Dossier Group, which is part of Hordakovsky's operation, which basically collects information from leaked emails of Russian government officials. And the Dossier Group discovered that there was all these leaked emails of the guy who was trying to manage the interference in the Madagascar election. And in the Madagascar election, there was I think there were 7 candidates, and the Russians bribed all 7 of them. And it wasn't even a lot of money. I can't remember. It was like $10,000 each or something like that, because they didn't know who was going to win. But they like placed their bets everywhere, so that no matter what, whoever won was going to be beholden to Russia. And what the Russians are very good
Yeah.
at is just finding the weak link, and oftentimes the weak links everywhere. And that's what they do with all of these these far right groups. They've discovered that the AfD in Germany, the far right group, which has gotten
Hmm.
much support recently, they were taking money from the Russians. Marine Le Pen, the French far right candidate, there was not even she wasn't even ashamed of it. She was took a huge loan from a Czech bank owned by Russians, um, and on and on and on. And so and the Russians,
Donald Trump. I mean, there's too many Russians in that sphere there. I mean,
well, and
they're out there messing around with our body politics in the West.
but here's the thing: is that it's much cheaper to spend like $70,000 on 7 different candidates in Madagascar than to send in like the Black Sea Fleet to it costs you almost nothing to do these operations. I mean, it's just de
Hmm.
minimis, and it has unbelievable influence.
And
You
far less risky, and you don't end up losing a war, which in Russian history usually means a shift in the Kremlin. Yeah, no, 100%. I agree.
and so they also end up corroding the support for Ukraine by European countries, and potentially, if Donald Trump gets elected, by the United States.
Yeah, yeah, God forbid. Let's talk a little bit about an issue that is part of the war effort here in Ukraine, and there are widespread calls. Uh, the assets that have been seized, not least of which under the Magnitsky Act, there's discussion of using those seized assets and transferring them here to Ukraine to support either in the war effort or in compensation. I know that you have been outspoken in this issue, but I'd like to. What are the risks, the potential risks, and the potential rewards for doing a pretty unprecedented act of taking all those seized assets and redistributing them?
Well, the first thing I would say is not unprecedented. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States confiscated the Iraqi central bank reserves after the end of the Second World War. German government reserves were confiscated. The only thing that's new about this particular proposal is that we're talking about doing it before the war ends. That's the only thing unique about it. And so you've got a bunch of what I call chicken littles that say that, oh my God, if we do this, the sky is going to fall. It's going to be the most terrible thing in the world. The world is going to never be like the same again. And that's complete nonsense. The argument is that somehow nobody's going to want to keep their money in euros or dollars after this whole thing happens because, oh, God forbid, these countries confiscated Putin's central bank reserves. Well, that's just nonsense. First of all, the only reason why your reserves would ever be confiscated is if you start a war of aggression against a neighboring country and do $1 trillion of damage. That's a pretty small subset of all the reserves that are around the world. And secondly, it's not as if anyone has any options. If you have money that you've generated from exports, which is China and Saudi Arabia and all these countries, it's not like you can keep that money in Iranian rials and Argentine pesos. Those are, crazy economic basket case places. You want to keep your money in like stable economies, in rule of law economies. And rule of law is you don't go invading your neighbors, or otherwise your money gets confiscated. And so it's just a complete nonsense, mostly spread by Putin and his cronies about this world coming to an end if we do this. It's just utter foolishness to say that. And there is one consequence, which is not an unexpected consequence, it's an expected consequence, which is that if China, who has more central bank reserves than Russia in the West, sees this happening, maybe they won't invade Taiwan. And wouldn't that be a good thing?
Yeah. And a cost saver ultimately in the end as well. I can tell you, but from being here in Ukraine, the scale of damage and suffering that I have seen is absolutely 100% worthy of really serious compensation. So I, for one, am all for it. Let's move on to the question of sanctions. Very severe sanction programs have been set up since the full-scale invasion. There are massive gaps and problems with the sanction program. And I think it ties into this issue you brought up with the seizure of assets and this kind of like, oh, the sky is falling, be afraid of the big bad bear. There seems to be a sanctions issue where it's like people are still willing to kind of, grease their palms where they can. What do you think of the sanctions program, where it's been successful and where it has not, and maybe, how can we make it better?
Well, so first of all, this is another one of these sort of misunderstandings. So Putin is the main communicator of this theme that sanctions aren't working. He's saying, look, we're just doing so well. Sanctions are not hurting us at all. We're just all good. And by the way, they're hurting you. So why do you even bother with it? Why don't you just stop it? You're just hurting yourself. We're fine. That's his pitch. The answer is that he's not fine. He's getting pummeled in ways that were unimaginable to him. As we all know, $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves are frozen. Hundreds of billions of dollars of oligarch money is frozen. All the Russian companies and banks and government agencies are banned from borrowing money in the international capital markets. Companies have left. Million able-bodied Russian men have left. It's a mess. It's a mess over there. And so to say that sanctions aren't working is just not correct. However, you're not wrong.
All you have to do is look at Gazprom operating in the red, which would have been insane just a few years ago, and because it's a pillar of their economy. But I'll grant you that it's kind of a Putin narrative, but there are criticisms to be had about the sanctions.
You're not wrong. I mean, they're not wrong that Russia still functions. Okay, so Russia is still at war with Ukraine. It can still afford to buy missiles and bombs and all sorts of other nastiness to kill Ukrainians. And the reason for that is for one simple reason, which is that the one huge commodity that Russia continues to enjoy the full economic benefits of is oil. They're one of the largest oil exporters in the world. They're responsible for about 10% of the world's oil supply. And up until now, we've said, you know what? We're so scared of jacking up the price of oil by touching Russian oil supplies because of inflation, and we don't want inflation in our countries, that we're going to let them export their oil. And so as a result of that, Russia is making between $500 million and $1 billion a day on oil exports. And then they're spending that money on North Korean artillery and Iranian drones and all sorts of other nastiness. And so here we are in the West giving Russia the money to kill Ukrainians and then giving Ukrainians some money to fight back. And we're all saying, well, but we're getting impatient. I mean, the easy way to solve this problem is to bite the bullet and figure out a way to get other oil producing countries to increase oil output and then do a total embargo on Russian oil. If we did that, which would be hard to do, and it's kind of, there's a lot of things I can imagine. I can't really imagine that happening. But if we did, Putin would be out of business in 9 months.
Yeah, no, well, um, uh, we just had the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And during that forum, they were making big claims about BRICS and how this will be a counterbalance to Western economic unions and things of this nature, and that then BRICS will expand and things like that. Notwithstanding the fundamental idea to which currency are you going to peg a BRICS currency. I can't see a Russian accepting pegging the ruble to the rupee, or a Chinese guy pegging the yuan to the South African rand. But putting that aside, what is the BRICS a way out for them to find a solution? I mean, they certainly were saying it would expand and become this massive counterbalance. What's your take on the
Well,
possibility BRICS might save them?
if we look at who the buyers of Russian oil are, it's China, India, and Turkey. Those are the three countries that are the major buyers of Russian crude oil at the moment. So, from that perspective, those three countries, Turkey's not in the BRICS, but those three countries are providing Russia, a way to sort of knuckle through this economic crisis that they're having because of everything else, because of the sanctions and all the other stuff. But this whole idea of BRICS is just a complete and utter nonsense. It was a marketing term invented in Goldman Sachs in order to sell funds, BRICS funds, Brazil, Russia, India, and China funds back in the day when people were interested in those countries. And I even managed or advised HSBC on their BRICS fund back in the day when I was in Moscow. And happy for this marketing term, but these countries have almost nothing to do with one another. I mean, India and China are kind of enemies with one another, really. I mean, they even have like military conflicts over their borders, and so we look at so the only and of all these countries, the only one that's got like a good economy right now is India. So China is going through all sorts of contortions trying to deal with all their economic problems. Brazil is got inflation, all over the place. Russia's nothing good happening there, and South Africa is an economic basket case. And so I don't think that there's any great savior for the world of this BRICS. And as you mentioned, what currency are they going to settle their trades in? There was this great story about how India was buying all this Russian oil, and they were afraid of U.S. sanctions, and so they told the Russians, "We can only pay you in rupees." And so Russians started to accumulate all these rupees. And they said, well, we don't want to sell you any more oil because what are we going to do with these rupees? There's nothing we've already bought as much tea as we can handle. There's nothing else that we want to buy from you guys. And that's the problem, is that these are not convertible currencies. They're not currencies of trade. They're not stable currencies. And so it's completely, and so what are they going to do? All team up together and like join their currencies together into currency union? I don't think so. No one is going to want to do that. And so this is just, again, bluster. It's like Putin saying sanctions aren't working. The BRICS are not going to be the savior for Russia. Now, of course, China is going to sell stuff to Russia and buy Russian oil, but that's not going to save Russia. Russia's in a very economically desperate situation.
Well, we're going to start to wrap it up here, but just to follow up on that, I mean, what is I am not an economist. I don't claim to be one. But what is your prognosis for the future of Russia's economy, you know, in the next year, 2 years or so?
Well, I think that it's going to keep on bumbling along. As long as oil prices stay at these levels, they generate revenues. And for all the stuff that was sort of shut down or divested from the Russian economy, they filled it in with the production of weapons and tanks and jeeps and planes and so on. And so they have what's called a wartime economy, which is funded by oil and then spent domestically on all this wartime stuff, and that's going to be the next 2 years, the next 5 years probably of Russia is a wartime economy funded by oil.
Yeah, and it seems far greater minds than mine to understand this are saying to me that it's almost like the economy's on a bit of a sugar high. Because critics of the West say, well, look, Russia's economy has survived all that the West has thrown it at, and yet it is still, continuing. But others will say, no, no, this is because of this massive influx of money from the state coffers to keep the war effort going. And that can only last for so long before you know, the oil runs out and the machinery starts to grind.
Well,
What's your take on this kind of military industrial economy?
well, it works as long as they can fund it, but the funding it, how do they fund it? They don't have any more reserves. The reserves they've run down. They have a budget deficit. Um, in other words, the government doesn't collect taxes in the same proportion as they're spending the money, and so they need cash, cold hard cash, which at the moment they get from oil. Um, if we were able to we don't have to fully embargo the oil, but maybe we just somehow make it so unprofitable for people to buy Russian oil that so few people want to do it that the price goes down 50%. These are things we could do. And if we did that, they would be in deep trouble. But as long as there's oil and as long as they're spending it on arms and as long as that's going on, then it's sort of filling in for where the regular economy was. I mean, if literally 40% of the government budget in Russia is spent on defense now, or offense, I should say, not defense, they're not defending anything. They're offending. Um, and
Yeah.
that's
Aggression.
yeah, that's not what happens in most countries.
Yeah, it's distressing to say the least. That so much like our kind of war effort support, the economic support, and the things that we say, we intend to do to punish Russia for this illegal war. There also seems to be some reluctance to really tackle the issue, and I don't know where that comes from in the West, where there's kind of fear of the big bad bear, or also, benefiting from the lucrative oil trade that they can. But either way, the West still doesn't, I think, have come to the conclusion that this is a real existential threat for both sides of the equation. You, having spent enough time in Russia and studying Russia, certainly know this for a fact that they're not going to stop.
Yep.
This is a almost like a winner take all. I don't want to categorize it like that, but we got to get our act together. Are you as frustrated as I am sometimes with kind of Western? I don't want to say inaction because obviously we're doing a lot, but boy, we could be doing this better in a lot of different ways, militarily and economically.
Well, I'm probably 7 times more frustrated. I've been going around the world trying to explain how Vladimir Putin is a mafia murderer who needs to be stopped and contained, and I've been saying this for a long time to a lot of people, and for the most part, people didn't listen to me, and this is the war as a result.
Yeah, no, I mean, even I was in Moscow during the apartment bombings. I knew this guy was bad news from the very, very start. And we, if we didn't hold responsibility for his rise to power, I do have some criticism for the West in the terms of like, oh, this is a guy we can work with. No, he's not a guy we can work with. And we should have known that from the get-go, from his rise to power, with the blood of his own people. That should have been, that should have sent alarms. But because it was expedient for us to try and work with him.
Yeah.
So I'm with you there. We should have been doing more. As we, again, head towards a conclusion here, you and I were both in Moscow in the 90s. You and I both saw the kind of chaos of the 90s. Vladimir Putin, in his rise to power, aside from the fact that the cruelty and the blood upon which he rose to power, he also did it with an implicit contract with the people of Russia. And that is, I will take away the chaos of Yeltsin. I will restore us as a great global power. I will do this. I will do that. Just turn a blind eye to our corruption. Just don't worry about the civil rights infringements. That's the tacit agreement that we make. We now see Russia as a pariah. We see the economy falling apart, infrastructure falling apart. We see their soldiers going to their death. This is a betrayal of the contract with the Russian people that was made in the 90s and gave him power. How much time has Vladimir Putin got, do you think?
Well, you're absolutely right that it used to be he had a carrot and a stick. The carrot was economics, and the stick was oppression. Now all he has is a stick, and so that's a tenuous, brittle place to be. But as long as he's using the stick effectively, which he has so far been using, anytime someone stands up against him, their plane gets blown up or they get sent off to jail for 25 years. Um, that sends a very powerful message. The message is that there's no, and Alexei Navalny was killed in prison. There's no, there doesn't seem to be any upside to standing up against him, and so at the moment nobody is until the moment that they do, and we don't know when that moment will be. So Putin could be 2 weeks away from being overthrown, or he could be never overthrown, and everything in between. I mean, look at the North Korea situation. You now have like 3 generations of the same family oppressing their country. But you can also look at Yanukovych in Ukraine, and he got run out of town very quickly. And same thing with many other dictators in many other countries. I don't have a prediction, and nor does Putin have a prediction. He's sitting there watching, reruns of the of Gaddafi being, bayoneted in a sewer pipe, and thinking, he doesn't want that to happen to him. And so, that's kind of, we're all sitting there, he's sitting there, nobody knows how long it's going to last. And he's desperate to make sure it lasts a very long time, and will do a lot of very terrible things, including sending hundreds of thousands of young men to their death in Ukraine just to stay in power.
Well, as somebody who's on the ground here in Ukraine and is oftentimes under fire from Russian missiles, or, living with friends and loved ones here on the ground who are truly, truly suffering from this illegal and aggressive war, I'm all for it. The sooner we can get rid of Vladimir Putin, in my mind, the better. So, Bill Browder, what can the West do to hasten his demise?
Well, there's 2 things we can do. We can provide the
Literally or figuratively.
we can provide the weapons. The West can provide the weapons that Ukrainians have been begging for to finish off the job. And we can give them the financial resources by confiscating Russian central bank reserves so that they have the money to fight off the Russians. And those are the 2 things we can do. Ukrainians are the ones fighting at the front line. They're the ones spilling blood. But we should be doing everything in our power financially with weapons and with money so that they achieve the objective. So in the West, we don't have to be suffering the same tragedy that Ukraine is suffering from right now, because Putin's not stopping with Kiev.
No, he is not. In one way, shape, or form, he is a threat to the globe. Well, Robert, thank you for your time very much this week here on The Edge, and thank you for being a great supporter for Ukraine. I can tell you firsthand that people appreciate your efforts, and so thank you for supporting Ukraine.
Thank you.